Do you remember those old working man's dinners? The ones you could only find in cookbooks nobody opens anymore? They fed tired hands and hungry families with simple, filling food that got the job done. Isn't it time we looked at what we left behind? Peanut butter noodles might seem like a blasphemy of several degrees when you first hear about it, but keep an open mind, an empty stomach, and very, very short patience, and you'll see where people are coming from. Peanut butter noodles were essentially the go-to for most people when they were really trying to stretch things out, and they wouldn't be out in grocery marts buying packets of egg noodles or spaghetti. They would be making it at home using wheat and flour or whatever substitutes they could find. It was actually a very admirable trait back then. People were really against buying anything that could be made at home. But just noodles don't really do the trick at all, does it? It doesn't help ease that hunger. I mean, it might fill you up, but there's also the psychological aspect of eating, right? You want to feel fulfilled after a meal, and when you don't, it's pretty natural for people to keep eating. When that wasn't an option, meals like this became godsends because they were simple ways of adding flavor, any kind of flavor to dishes that were otherwise so bland, boring, and dry on their own, but had to be eaten out of necessity, because what else were you going to do? Cornish game hen, a petite and elegant poultry choice, typically weighs no more than 2 pounds and is ideal for serving as an individual portion, making it perfect for an upscale dinner. These hens are usually roasted whole, seasoned lightly with herbs like thyme and sage, and basted in butter to achieve a crispy golden skin while keeping the meat juicy and tender. The cavity may be stuffed with a flavorful blend of breadcrumbs, chopped vegetables, and herbs, enriching the meat during cooking. The cooking process often involves high-temperature roasting to crisp the skin, followed by a resting period before serving to ensure the meat remains moist. Serving Cornish game hens on a bed of wild rice or alongside roasted vegetables allows their delicate flavors to shine, making them a favored choice for intimate dining and special occasions due to their ideal portion size and visually appealing presentation. Let's head on over to how people did things in the winter. Acorn squash with wild rice and herbs was one of the best holiday season combinations to have during all this mess, and that was for a few reasons. Wild rice was a regional thing. It was an important food source for indigenous communities that had long-held traditions around foraging and growing it. They knew what they were doing, so despite the toughness of the Dust Bowl's environment, they managed to get away with some amount of it. Herbs, on the other hand, were very bare bones. You had your pantry staples like oregano, mint, thyme, and parsley, but beyond that, you shouldn't expect much. Acorn squash was the real star of the show here. It could be used in a lot of things, but that wasn't what was special about it. This was one resilient crop. I mean, seriously, it barely failed. Comparatively to all the others, it seemed like squashes were still far easier to grow than most other things. It is only natural for people to then start adopting things like acorn squash with wild rice and herbs into their diet. They had already become a lot more familiar with wild rice than you'd expect, but dishes like these, especially in the winter, only hammered that appreciation home even more. Stuffed pork chops are a comforting classic, stuffed to the brim with a savory blend and often served dripping in rich gravy. This dish found its place in the hearts of Americans in the mid-20th century, particularly loved in the Midwest and southern states. The preparation starts by cutting a pocket into pork chops, which are then filled with a stuffing made from breadcrumbs, onions, celery, and herbs. Once stuffed, the chops are browned until they sport a perfect golden crust, then baked to tender perfection. A favorite for family dinners and Sunday roasts, its hearty and filling nature made it a beloved meal. Stuffed pork chops are a testament to the versatility of pork, accommodating a variety of stuffings from apples to mushrooms, allowing everyone to tailor it to their taste. Not every seafood dish came from the ocean. Some came straight from a can. In a time when fresh shrimp was a luxury for coastal towns, canned shrimp offered an affordable way for working-class families to bring a little seafood into their diets. Mixed with peas in a thick, creamy white sauce and served over crackers or toast, this dish had a playful name, Shrimp Wiggle. But it was all business when it came to stretching ingredients. Canned shrimp had been around since the early 20th century, marketed as a convenient alternative to fresh shellfish. By the 1960s, it found its way into all kinds of home-cooked meals, from salads to casseroles. In this dish, it was combined with a simple white sauce, a budget-friendly staple made from butter, flour, and milk that turned just about anything into a filling, stick-to-your-ribs meal. The peas added a pop of color and a bit of sweetness, balancing out the richness of the sauce. Served over saltines or toasted white bread, it wasn't fancy, but it was warm, comforting, and familiar. For many kids, it was their first introduction to seafood, whether they liked it or not. Some remember it fondly, while others never quite warmed up to the idea of shrimp that came from a can. Chicken fried steak. This classic is long gone but never forgotten. This one's pretty easy to make too. All you need is a chicken steak dredged in a seasoned flour mixture, dipped in a wet batter, and finally coated in a crispy breading. Fry till it's golden brown for the perfect dinner that'll leave you wanting more. Chicken fried steak is typically served with a creamy gravy for dipping, along with mashed potatoes and vegetables for a complete and oh-so-satisfying meal. It is basically American, and the yassified version of the Austrian dish Wiener Schnitzel, and the Italian dish cotoletta alla Milanese. Fancy names, but the same old fried chicken steak. Now I know what you're thinking. Why did this crispy golden goodness leave us too soon? Well, you can trick yourself all you want, but it's not the healthiest dinner out there. But hey, having a fried steak once in a while can't do much harm, right? Just be prepared for some finger-licking good action. This dish is messy, but in the best way possible. In medieval Europe, fish and root vegetables were the most common thing for a majority of the population. Most of them could not afford to sustainably get meat every single time they went out for grocery shopping. It was also something that was really preferred by religious followers of the church, although I can't really imagine a specific reason why. For root vegetables, I can see veganism being something a well-intending church appreciates, but then why the meat? If there are any history buffs in the comments, let us know. Now, the dish itself would change a lot. This would heavily depend on the kind of climate and geography you were working with. Coastal regions, like along the North Sea or the Baltic, for example, had a dense ecosystem of marine life. They had herring, whiting, haddock and cod, salmon or crabs, and people would often just work with whatever the catch of the day was. These fish would be salted and dried as much as they could, both for inland trade and for winter preservation. Root vegetables were also dearly important to people because they were one of the few kinds of vegetables that could withstand poor soils and still last through the winter. One of these vegetables was the iconic carrot, and here's an interesting fact. In medieval times, you actually had purple and yellow carrots instead of orange. Lentil soups were even more common in the medieval world. They would change a lot depending on the region, though. For example, in Europe's southern regions like Provence and Spain, lentils were not only used to feed humans, but also to feed animals. Lentil pottages were one of the most important meals for the church as well, because when the fast would break, this was one of the few meals that could feed an entire group and still be very easy to prepare. Lentils would provide an incredible dose of protein, and it would need just water and a few other vegetables if you could spare them. Onions, leeks, and garlic, or just some savory or sage would work really well. In the Middle East and North Africa, lentil soups were something else entirely. Medieval Arab cookbooks like Anwa al-Saidala F. Alwan al-Atima would feature all kinds of lentil recipes with an incredible amount of flavoring, seasonings, and spices to make it stand out from other dishes. It would be a lot more bombastic and flavorful than European versions of the same dish, and if looking at today's world is any example, I think it's historically accurate to say that they've always had us beat when it comes to working with legumes. At a glance, it looked like fried chicken on a stick. But take one bite, and the secret was out. There wasn't a shred of chicken in sight. In the 1960s, when poultry prices soared, working-class families in industrial cities like Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit turned to a clever alternative: skewered, breaded, and fried pork or veal, known as city chicken. The name was a bit of a joke. Chicken was considered a luxury in certain areas, but pork and veal, those were cheap, especially in regions with a strong meatpacking industry. But appearance mattered, and with a little ingenuity, cubed cuts of meat were threaded onto wooden skewers, giving the illusion of a drumstick. Once dredged in flour, dipped in egg wash, and coated in breadcrumbs, it was pan-fried until golden brown and crispy. Some families took it a step further, baking the skewers in a bit of broth for extra tenderness. Eastern European immigrants had been making versions of it since the early 20th century, and by the 1960s it was a staple at Sunday dinners and potlucks. It might not have been real chicken, but in a time when stretching a dollar mattered more than labels, it didn't need to be. Cabbage steaks with garlic sauce were another example of that mock food culture I was talking about. So that's definitely a bit of a stretch when it comes to what exactly can classify as an imitation and not just flat-out blasphemy. Cabbage steaks actually did end up coming close, though. People got really creative during the Dust Bowl because of how they just had nothing to work with. Poor harvests full of failed crops, scarcity, and just the general circumstances of every average day were really pushing them to their limits. Still, what hit really badly wasn't how hard everything was, but how rare the normal things had become. A good steak, chicken nuggets, some nice hash browns, a good Christmas, stuff like that. It was these little everyday joys that completely went out of people's lives that made the biggest difference. This is also exactly why people began to imitate things like steaks. Cabbage steaks were really thick slices of cabbage, so they'd have a bit of a weighty bite to them, and then they would be roasted and grilled until they were crispy. Then people would make a garlic sauce with it and serve it as is. The sad part of this whole thing was that cabbage steaks were honestly just something that the people living with ovens could afford. You needed to preheat the oven for this and use baking paper, which weren't things that people were able to spend their money on. Some of the best things in life came from improv, and hobo stew is pretty much the exact same. Hobo stew is pretty much a dish that was made out of sheer necessity. It doesn't have a set-in-stone recipe or any strict guidelines to follow. With this recipe, all you really need to do is essentially just take whatever vegetables and meat scraps you have, or just whatever you have in your pantry, and keep it in one pot. This essentially stews, and the end result is usually a complete wild card. Not only is this a good way to make use of everything in your house, ensuring nothing goes to waste, but it's also a pretty handy way of checking out your cooking skills. A lot of the reason dishes like these were even good in the first place is because people had an intuitive understanding of what flavors would work, how much of something to add, how long to let something stay on the stove, and that's just something you develop from trial and error, so get to experimenting instead of ordering. Potato and chickpea curry with rice was a really good combination that was pretty much built for the environment people were finding themselves in the Dust Bowl. The recipe changed with each different area and state, but for the most part, the core mix of potatoes, dried peas, and rice was the same. People would substitute white rice with brown rice wherever they could because the latter was cheaper, and it made sense to stretch your pantries out as much as you possibly could. Potatoes, especially, were a rock-solid friend to rely on for the American people. They were one of the easiest things you could possibly grow. You could make so many things perfect for a large number of people with them, and they were full of health benefits. A side bonus was that they'd really keep you full, but all this should give you an idea. It was almost impossible to exist without having a good stock of potatoes in your root basement. Onions, garlic, a water-based broth, and just thyme and salt pepper were used for the curry. Pretty bare bones, right? Yet to them, that was still a phenomenal dish to come home to. Coq au vin stands out as a rich, soul-warming dish that is achieved through a slow cooking process that melds the flavors of chicken and wine thoroughly. Traditionally used to soften tough roosters, modern recipes often utilize chicken, marinated, and then braised in wine, typically red, along with mushrooms, onions, garlic, and a bouquet garni. Initially, the chicken is seared until golden, then simmered slowly with lardons, which infuse a smoky depth. This technique showcases French braising skills, starting with a high sear followed by a gentle, prolonged cooking in a covered pot, allowing the intricate flavors to blend and enhance the meat. The selection of wine is pivotal, forming a flavorful sauce base that deeply seasons the chicken, transforming it into a hearty, deeply satisfying stew that exemplifies rustic yet refined French cooking. Baked bell peppers with millet filling is a pretty delicious and flavorful idea. It works well since millet is both cheap, versatile, and really good for you. Plus, it doubled as an option for people who had allergies to gluten. It's not often talked about, but living life with any kind of medical conditions becomes a real pain during times like these. Most people's response, hell, even the government's, is to make supplies and resources available for able-bodied people. On the other hand, bell peppers were something that people were still able to grow really easily around them whenever they found the chance to between growing celery and potatoes. Some common additions were things like garlic, onions, whatever you had been stocking up on growing beforehand. The best part about this dish was how it really boosted your energy for the day, which is something typically expected of spices. Still, it goes double for anything that's a stuffed bell pepper. It's a whole new experience, which, if you've had it, then you must be very familiar with the kind of zoomies I'm talking about. What's your experience with bell peppers like? Shepherd's pie is a homely casserole crafted with ground meat and vegetables, crowned with a layer of mashed potatoes. Originally from the United Kingdom and dating back to the late 18th century, this dish traditionally uses lamb, as the name shepherd suggests, differentiating it from cottage pie, which uses beef. The typical preparation involves sautéing ground lamb with onions, carrots, and peas, then topping it with a creamy layer of mashed potatoes and baking it until it achieves a golden color. Shepherd's pie was a dining staple in both British and American homes throughout the 1970s, offering a robust and comforting meal. It gained particular favor during the colder months, providing a warming, comforting dish perfect for family dinners or gatherings where its layered textures and flavors were particularly appreciated. When dinner had to come together fast and money was tight, there was one golden rule: nothing went to waste. Leftover potatoes, stray bits of meat, a spoonful of peas from last night's dinner, it all had a place in the baking dish. Held together with a can of condensed soup or a ladle of thick gravy, garbage plate casserole was less about following a recipe and more about cleaning out the fridge. Working-class families in the 1960s didn't have the luxury of throwing away food, and casseroles like this turned scraps into something filling. Canned soups, especially cream of mushroom or cream of chicken, were kitchen workhorses, stretching ingredients while adding richness. Crackers or breadcrumbs on top gave it that familiar golden crust, making it feel like a meal rather than a collection of leftovers. It was never the same dish twice, but that was part of its charm. One night it might taste like last Sunday's roast beef. The next, it had the essence of yesterday's pork chops. No one knew exactly what they were going to get, but that didn't matter. It was warm, it was filling, and most importantly, it was a reminder that a little creativity could turn scraps into supper. Stuffed peppers. Forget those boring pre-made things you see at the grocery store because stuffed peppers are here to save the day. We're talking about the beautiful bell peppers Grandma made on Thanksgiving. Vibrant red, yellow, or orange peppers are hand-picked and carefully hollowed out and then stuffed with a flavorful mixture of fluffy rice, seasoned ground meat, and your choice of chopped vegetables. Once stuffed, these peppers are baked to perfection until they are tender and crisp. Now, this isn't just a casual meal. Whipping up a stuffed pepper might make you feel like a master chef in the kitchen. It's also a great way to use up leftover rice and ground meat. Bonus points. If you use their visual appeal to trick your children into getting their daily dose of veggies. Yeah, the little ones don't really go for the green peppers on the table, but they might just love these stuffed peppers. You might even add some cheese to top it off. Unfortunately, it is one of those dishes that has faded from many dinner tables. For families stretching their grocery budget, few meals delivered as much flavor and comfort as these unusual-looking meatballs. A product of the Great Depression and wartime rationing, porcupine meatballs were a creative way to make ground beef go further. Mixing rice into the meat wasn't just for texture. It bulked up the meal, making a pound of beef feed more mouths. Rice was an affordable pantry staple, and when the meatballs simmered in a tangy tomato sauce, the grains softened and expanded, giving them their signature spiky appearance. Despite the name, no porcupines were harmed in the making of this dish. Just a bit of kitchen ingenuity at work. Some recipes used canned tomato soup for a mild, creamy sauce, while others relied on crushed tomatoes and Worcestershire sauce for a sharper kick. Either way, the slow cooking process allowed the flavors to meld into a hearty, stick-to-your-ribs meal. For decades, this dish was a go-to for busy home cooks. It was easy, required minimal ingredients, and could be made in one pot, ideal for feeding a growing family. But as convenience foods and pre-made meatballs filled grocery store freezers, the homemade version started to disappear. Apple and nut porridge was a delightful, nutritious dish that would be somewhere in between everyday food and a celebratory treat. Now see, porridge was something that had a lot of colorful variations in the medieval world. Typically, it would be made with oats and millet, but if that wasn't available, then people could also just use different kinds of grains like rye or barley. During harvest season is when the party would really get going, though. That's when people would have abundant access to fruits and nuts, and that's when porridge could be turned into something significantly more special than what they were used to. Wild and homegrown apples were incredibly reliable. They would thrive in pretty much most major European countries. Apple orchards were something that would be seen in most village commons and monasteries too. Apples would be chopped, sliced, and simmered until they were just a little bit sweet, and nuts would be crushed and stirred into the porridge. This was a great breakfast, but if you had honey, some warm spices, and a bit of cream, it was something fit for a feast. There was a time when Sunday dinner wasn't complete without a plate of slow-cooked, gravy-drenched pork chops. Smothered in rich, savory onion gravy and served alongside a heaping portion of mashed potatoes, this dish was a cornerstone of Southern home cooking. It was an experience, one that filled the kitchen with the unmistakable aroma of comfort. Pork was an affordable alternative to beef, making it a practical choice for families looking to stretch their grocery budget. Bone-in chops were particularly popular, as they were both flavorful and inexpensive. The slow cooking process allowed even the toughest cuts to become fork tender, absorbing the deep, savory notes of the seasoned gravy. Some cooks swore by a cast-iron skillet, while others let the dish simmer in a slow cooker for hours, ensuring the pork melted in your mouth. But as convenience foods and boneless, skinless meats took over the supermarket, this dish began to disappear. Quick-fix dinners replaced slow-simmered meals, and thick homemade gravies gave way to powdered mixes and canned alternatives. Today, smothered pork chops are a rare sight at the dinner table. But for those who remember the first bite of a perfectly tender chop covered in rich, peppery gravy, it's a dish worth revisiting. Eggs and milk, two of the most basic ingredients in any 1960s kitchen, were the foundation of a meal that felt more like a science experiment than dinner. Floating island dinner, as it was sometimes called, involved poaching eggs in a thin milk broth, then serving them over toast with a dusting of paprika. It was cheap, it was filling, and while it may have looked unusual, it made the most of what families had on hand. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and relatively inexpensive compared to meat. Poaching them in milk was a way to add richness without using butter or oil, and the broth itself didn't go to waste. It soaked into the toast, creating a soft, custard-like texture that was surprisingly satisfying. Paprika wasn't just for color. It added a hint of warmth and spice to an otherwise mild dish. This kind of meal had roots in old-fashioned frugality. Similar recipes had been around for generations, passed down from an era when every ingredient had to serve a purpose. For kids, it was a bit of a mystery. Why was dinner floating? But for parents, it was an easy, one-pan solution that turned a few simple staples into something warm and nourishing at the end of a long day. Parsnip and lentil stew was a really good dish. It had the earthiness of parsnips, which were a common thing to grow and buy in farmers' markets and grocery stores. And then you also had lentils. This was a lot better than the potato soups people had become accustomed to all the time while they were trying to make the day go by. It was rustic, nutritious, and it actually was the perfect thing to eat when it was cold. During the winter, it became so hard to afford to spend money on any kind of heating arrangements or winter shoppings. Parsnips and lentil stew was also a vegan-friendly meal, and if you think they hold on to their recipes now, you should have seen them back then. Man, nobody made life easy for them. The best thing about this stew was that you could adapt it to whatever it was you had on hand and could work with. Whether that was medium carrots, celery, tomatoes and onions, or chicken broths and herbs, it would work. All you had to do was adjust to taste, and you were ready to go. It was best to eat this warm, though it wouldn't really work well as a leftover meal. That's why people never made it in bulk unless they were cooking for the entire neighborhood. Crown roast of lamb is an exquisite dish often reserved for special occasions and holiday feasts. This majestic preparation involves arranging racks of lamb into a circular shape that resembles a crown, with ribs pointing skyward. It's seasoned with a mix of rosemary, garlic, and thyme, both in the marinade and as a rub applied before roasting. To enhance its flavor and retain moisture, the crown center is typically filled with a stuffing composed of breadcrumbs, minced garlic, herbs, and occasionally dried fruits like apricots or cranberries. The lamb is roasted until it achieves a tender texture and a beautifully browned exterior. Precision in tying the racks together ensures the roast cooks evenly. To perfect its presentation, chefs often cover the tips of the ribs with foil during roasting to prevent charring. This dish not only dazzles as a culinary delight, but also stands as a festive centerpiece, symbolizing celebration and feasting. Johnny cakes are an incredibly economical meal and also one with extreme amounts of history. They're something that have really deep roots in Native American cooking and also a very long record of being appropriated by settlers, but one way or the other, they managed to spread all over America. Let's cut to the chase. Johnny cakes are actually just fried cornmeal cakes, but they're flat and made on a pan fry. The difference between these and normal pancakes is that these ones actually do not have any kind of eggs, wheat, or leavening to them. And to be honest, that happens a fair amount of times. You may even have enough money to get those things, but you may just not have the energy to do groceries right now. And on days like that, who says you can't indulge in some corny history? You don't even need any kind of tools or ovens for this. All you need is a skillet or an iron griddle. Don't have baking powder? Not a problem. No yeast? Don't even worry about it. Johnny cakes have a massive history of being used in this way by everyone in the country, stretching first from the Narragansett people of Rhode Island to you and I today. That's some history, isn't it? Sometimes tradition would really come in handy. Okra stew with tomatoes and onions was a fine example of that. In southern U.S. culture, it was really common for people to pass down recipes of this dish within their own families, especially in predominantly African communities. Still, okra stew wasn't exclusive to any one group of people. Even those who came from the Middle East or had Mediterranean influences were making it. The reason it was so good was because it was one of the few dishes people were having which actually still had some flavor to it. Most of the stuff I'm describing right now, you can literally count the amount of ingredients in it by one hand. Not only that, they're not really pairing it up with any kind of cream, sauce, or dressing, so there's just not a lot of room for flavor. Not much to do with seasoning either. It gets bland, it gets dry, and it gets hard to eat for the 50th time in the past 2 months. Okra stew with tomatoes and onions wasn't something that had this problem. You could use canned tomatoes, a vegetable broth, some garlic you grew in the backyard, dried oregano and thyme, some vinegar if you had it, and then that was it. It sounded simple enough, and in practice it was. But it was so much more than just a dish. It was a silver lining. Do you know that feeling of coming back home to your favorite leftovers? That's just a happy coincidence for us, but imagine that in a time where you barely eat or barely get to eat after a long day of work. Don't you think the feeling would hit that much harder? Named in honor of the Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, chicken tetrazzini was reportedly whipped up by chef Ernest Arbogast at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco around the early 1900s. This dish, a testament to American culinary creativity, combines diced chicken and mushrooms with linguine or spaghetti in a sumptuous, creamy sauce that's often elevated with a splash of wine or sherry. Once assembled, it's liberally topped with grated Parmesan and baked until a golden crust forms on top. The addition of sherry or wine doesn't only boost the flavor, it also cuts through the cream's richness with its acidity. Typically, this dish is finished with a sprinkle of parsley or paprika to boost its visual appeal and add layers of subtle flavor. Despite its straightforward ingredients, chicken tetrazzini welcomes variations, such as almonds or pimentos, enhancing both its taste and texture. It's not just a delicious meal, but also a smart way to repurpose leftover chicken or turkey. Chicken divan is all about comfort, featuring chicken and broccoli smothered in a creamy cheese sauce, baked to perfection. It originated in the early 20th century at the Divan Parisien restaurant in New York City, named for the very place that concocted it. Initially designed as a showcase of the chef's skills in French cooking, chicken divan made its mark in the mid-20th century as a dish that blended sophistication with simplicity. To make it, layer cooked chicken and broccoli in a baking dish, pour over a sauce made from butter, flour, cream, and cheese, and bake until it's golden and bubbly. This dish is a testament to the fusion of French culinary art with the comfort of American home cooking, creating a truly delightful dish. Scrapple was traditionally a way to use up leftover pork scraps, but when meat was scarce or too expensive, another version took its place, one that relied on sweet potatoes and cornmeal instead. Sweet potato scrapple kept the same fried, crispy on the outside, soft on the inside texture, but swapped out meat for mashed sweet potatoes, mixed with cornmeal and spices, then molded into a loaf and sliced before frying. It was simple, cheap, and packed with enough flavor to make you forget there wasn't any pork in sight. Sweet potatoes were a Southern staple, affordable, nutritious, and easy to grow. Unlike white potatoes, they had a natural sweetness that made them versatile in both savory and sweet dishes. Combined with cornmeal, another low-cost kitchen essential, they created a filling, hearty meal that could be eaten on its own or served with eggs for breakfast. Seasonings varied by household. Some added cinnamon for warmth, others leaned into salt and pepper for a more savory bite. Families who grew up eating it remember the unmistakable sound of slices sizzling in a hot pan, the edges crisping up to golden perfection. Some of the best dishes come from necessity, and few ingredients are as dependable as potatoes. For generations, scalloped potatoes were a staple at homecoming dinners, potlucks, and Sunday feasts. Thinly sliced and baked in a rich, velvety sauce, they were a testament to the idea that simple ingredients, when treated right, could feel downright luxurious. Potatoes were the backbone of many American kitchens. They were cheap, easy to store, and could feed an entire family without much effort. The addition of a creamy sauce, made from milk, butter, and a touch of garlic, elevated this humble dish into something special. Some versions kept it simple, while others included layers of cheese, turning it into a gooey, golden masterpiece. Either way, it was a comforting, belly-filling side that paired well with just about any main course. The cooking process required patience. Proper scalloped potatoes weren't rushed. Each layer had to absorb the sauce, and the top needed time to develop that perfect golden crust. But as boxed potato mixes and instant gratins took over, homemade scalloped potatoes started to fade from dinner tables. Boiled bread dumplings were sometimes known as sinkers, mostly because they would just sit there as if they were sinking into the plate, but these were really as frugal as it would get. This was a dish that was made from old or stale bread, and all it took was fat, some eggs, or just an egg really, and bread, flour, and water. These dumplings were something you would see a lot in immigrant neighborhoods, especially the ones that were always around factories, industrial sites, construction sites, just heavy-duty neighborhoods where most laborers would live to cut down on commute. They started off as a way of just using stale bread so that it wouldn't go to waste. But the question is, how do you actually make dumplings at home like that? Well, the bread was just soaked in hot water, and the flour was mixed in so that it would hold. If an egg wasn't there, it would be a bit looser of a dish, but the dough would still be thickened, and the mixture would just need to be formed into rough balls. The dumplings were then simmered and boiled, and there you had it. Each immigrant community had its own different variation of this too. German, Eastern European, and Czech communities all had their own definition of what making this should be like. So it was exactly these gardens that would help people prepare for the next dish I'm going to talk about. During the Dust Bowl, vegetable stuffed zucchini would definitely seem like it was out of the reach of most. Vegetable zucchini actually used things like onions, tomatoes, and peppers, and that meant that you were eating pretty okay if you were stuffing it full of these things. The herbs were pretty much all homegrown too, and the beans. During the Dust Bowl, people were relying on whatever was available, so each serving of vegetable zucchini was vastly different than the last one. You'd take that and work with it, but people were really just making do with what they had. They'd throw in homegrown herbs if they could spare some, and some beans and peas. It would honestly be more of a meal than I'm making it sound. You should try vegetable zucchini sometime. Or if you have, did you like them? What was your experience like? Moussaka is a rich, layered Greek casserole that marries slices of eggplant with ground meat and a creamy bechamel sauce. This dish has Middle Eastern origins but was perfected in its modern form by Greek chef Nikolaos Tselementes in the early 20th century. Preparing moussaka involves frying slices of eggplant, layering them with a spicy meat mixture traditionally made with lamb or beef, and then smothering it all under a luscious bechamel sauce. Once assembled, it's baked until the top turns a tempting golden brown, offering a deep, flavorful feast. Moussaka made a name for itself in Greek cuisine and entered American dining scenes in the mid-20th century, often served with a side salad or bread for a balanced, fulfilling dinner. Moussaka is a rich, layered Greek casserole that marries slices of eggplant with ground meat and a creamy bechamel sauce. This dish has Middle Eastern origins but was perfected in its modern form by Greek chef Nikolaos Tselementes in the early 20th century. Preparing moussaka involves frying slices of eggplant, layering them with a spicy meat mixture traditionally made with lamb or beef, and then smothering it all under a luscious bechamel sauce. Once assembled, it's baked until the top turns a tempting golden brown, offering a deep, flavorful feast. Moussaka made a name for itself in Greek cuisine and entered American dining scenes in the mid-20th century, often served with a side salad or bread for a balanced, fulfilling dinner. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. Poor people would have very limited options for food back then. While you might think that since there weren't any taxes, jobs, or grocery store price bumps to worry about, that doesn't necessarily mean it was easier. They had to rely on whatever they could forage, whatever they could grow, and whatever was easiest to buy. Oat gruel was a dish that basically became synonymous with being down on your luck because of this. Oats have, for centuries, been the silver lining in a deeply hungry and bad situation for a lot of people. But that was especially true during medieval times. Oat gruel is pretty much prison food too. Ever see those shows where the guy gets a porridge-looking slope of food? That's pretty much it. While it was nutritious and it had protein, the biggest reason people ate it was because of the amounts of fiber present in it. It would keep them full for much longer in the day and lead to less hunger pangs, but it also meant that they were continuously losing body fat without being able to make too much muscle. We're really starting to explore the deep end of medieval countryside cuisine now, so I hope you're still tuned. Our next item happens to be turnip stew, which is a textbook example of how people got their nutrition in those times. Potatoes were not actually the most widespread ingredient like they are today. It used to be turnips. This was especially true for Europe, where potatoes arrived by the 16th century. Turnips were favored because they could be preserved very easily in root cellars for winter. They were really easy to grow in poor soils, and they were hardy. Also, this was one of the few crops where even its root was edible. It wasn't a dish that had a lot of guidelines to follow, so in that respect it was a lot similar to how pottage worked. People would throw in whatever herbs, roots, aromatics, and scraps of meat and protein they had. One of the best things that would go along with turnip stew if it was available was beetroot and eggplant, which might be a surprise combination for you to hear, but was actually fairly common back then. Mock fried chicken steak is a really interesting one because this actually makes use of so many things in creative ways to mimic the texture, taste, and overall feeling of fried chicken steak. Traditionally, the recipe calls for cheap cuts of meat, but in the Great Depression, people were even running with non-meat ingredients thanks to World War II rationing, which really put a massive hole in America's overall meat supply. In the 50s, too, home cooks brought this recipe back when they really needed to stretch a small amount of protein or use government food. So if you make this dish with ground meat or beef pork and shape it into a patty, mix it with breadcrumbs and cracker crumbs, and then douse it in seasoned flour or cracker crumbs again, then pan fry it, you get a pretty decent imitation of chicken fried steak. You just have to be really careful with what kind of seasonings you use because it's also true that the kind of seasoning you go with decides how good of an imitation of a chicken fried steak this is. The most interesting part is probably the flour-based version, which was straight out of the Depression. People would make a fritter using flour, milk, and eggs to make something that resembled a steak, and this was seasoned and fried. There was no meat, but it was meant to imitate the breading, flour-y taste of the meal anyway. In all cases, it was a comfort meat. And a chunk of that comfort was that it kept your wallet in good health. So the next thing on our list is baked turnips and cream sauces. But dear viewer, I know you aren't 5, and I know you're curious about how cream sauces could even be a thing in a time like this. After all, if people were struggling to get enough milk and eggs, where on God's green earth were they finding the money to get cream for? You see, my friend, there was a stark difference in lifestyles between two types of people. Those that grew up in the city and those that grew up in the countryside. Now, for the people trapped in those urban jungles during the Dust Bowl, I completely agree with you. Where did they get their cream from? For the ones living in rural shanty towns, though, well, you gotta know that they came from a long tradition of farming, a tradition that by the 1930s was still relatively upheld by most families. This meant that lots of these farming households had their own cattle and cows, and that's how they would get their milk and cream. Baked turnips, on the other hand, were something that was more commonly seen in the cities. It was, after all, something that primarily required an oven. In rural areas, it was a lot more common for people to pass the time with boiled turnips instead, but sometimes people would get lucky and find themselves having baked turnips along with a cream sauce to go with it. Veal Parmigiana brings a little taste of Italian-American heritage to the table, featuring breaded veal cutlets smothered in tomato sauce and melted cheese. Born in the kitchens of Italian immigrant communities in the U.S., this dish was a clever adaptation of traditional Italian recipes, tailored to American tastes. It first surfaced in the early 20th century, with Italian-American families swapping out eggplant for veal. Introduced in Italian-American eateries soon after, veal Parmigiana became a staple. The preparation? Bread those veal cutlets, fry them up, layer with marinara sauce, and a good helping of mozzarella or parmesan, then bake it until it's bubbling and golden. It hit its peak popularity in the 1950s and 1960s, often accompanied by pasta, crafting a hearty and satisfying meal. In the Appalachian Mountains, resourcefulness was a way of life. When fresh food wasn't always guaranteed, families learned how to make the most of what they had, and that's where soured corn soup came in. This dish started with dried corn that had been left to ferment slightly, giving it a tangy depth of flavor. Simmered with onions and a chunk of fatback, it transformed into a rich, hearty soup that was as practical as it was unique. Corn was the backbone of Appalachian cooking, grown in backyard gardens and stored for winter months. Allowing it to sour slightly wasn't a mistake. It was a method passed down for generations, a natural way to enhance flavor when refrigeration wasn't an option. Fatback, a common cut of cured pork, added just enough richness to make the dish feel substantial, while onions provided a little sweetness to balance out the tang. This wasn't the kind of soup you'd find in a restaurant, but for mountain families, it was a familiar and comforting meal. Some grew up eating it with cornbread on the side, others with a spoon straight from the pot. Cheesy ham chowder. This creamy soup is a winter wonderland in a bowl. Imagine tender chunks of ham in a rich and creamy broth, loaded with potatoes, carrots, and other colorful vegetables. The secret weapon of this chowder? The generous amount of melty cheese takes the flavor to a whole new level. This soup is like your best friend on snow days. It's also a great way to use up leftover ham from the holidays. Just be careful not to burn your tongue. This cheesy chowder is addictive. This dish might sound fancy, but don't let the French name fool you. Chicken à la king is a creamy and delicious casserole that's surprisingly easy to make. Yeah, tender chicken pieces in a rich cream sauce with mushrooms, peas, and pimientos? Count me in. This casserole is typically served over rice or toast and is a reminder that classics never truly goes out of style. It's just not as popular as it was back in the day because you know what they say, all good things come to an end. But chicken à la king doesn't have to. It's too good to become a memory of the past. So, next time you're looking for a nostalgic and delicious meal, give this dish a try. So did any of these classic beloved dinners stir up tasty memories? If so, like this video, click subscribe, and stay tuned for more nostalgia trips. If you've ever had split pea soup or peas pudding, then you might be interested to know that it actually originated from peas porridge. It was a dish that was really high in calories, but it was also really filled with protein. This was even better for people growing up because back in the medieval times, if you did not happen to live near any huntable game or were not rich, you could simply forget about having any kind of meat. The taste of this was still okay enough without it, but it was better when there were bits here and there. It's actually something that most people thought was really comforting, and it was why people invested in growing peas. Peas were convenient because even cottagers and small-time families could start to grow them. When famines would hit, peas were one of the kinds of legumes that could grow even when other grains simply could not. Break time. 1 second. One of the other things that was pushed to the mainstream thanks to the Dust Bowl was the reliance on one-pot meals. Stuff like vegetable pot pie with a biscuit crust really made the rounds just about everywhere. It was because it was so easy to pool together different kinds of vegetables to make one massive serving of pot pie, oftentimes more than just for a family. People would basically realize this. If they shared the amount of vegetables and resources they had, they could honestly make a lot more. Community-based ingredient sharing and food preparation once again became a thing. Entire neighborhoods were once again eating together, and it was a big part of how people managed to survive. This pot pie was a one-stop solution to massive amounts of hunger, and often people would throw in whatever kind of vegetables they had in there. This would typically look like your average mix of cabbage, onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and the rest, but people would try to add in aromatics to get some flavor going too. It was little stuff like this that really helped keep things together for everyone because, on their own, people didn't have the energy to cook big meals like this very often. Just the way corned beef hash was revolutionary because it made beef so available, canned tomato sauce was the same. Macaroni and tomatoes is an example of how people received the introduction of canned food with a lot of excitement. I mean, if you were told that you didn't have to spend half an hour in the kitchen beating up sticky tomatoes to make a paste, and you could just go buy one for a few cents, wouldn't you be happy? Plus, it was an excuse to get out of the house. At least we have grocery store escapes in common. We also have macaroni and tomatoes in common, mostly because just like bacon ends and boiled greens, this is a dish that would hold up perfectly in today's culinary climate. Boiled elbow macaroni would be mixed with canned or fresh tomatoes or tomato paste, finished with just a bit of grease, lard, or butter, and then seasoned with salt and pepper. While the flavor of the dish was mostly the same, what was really interesting was the way its texture could change so wildly. This could be made like a stew, thick and velvety, or it could be made like a soup, creamy and slightly thin, but overall thick. People definitely took advantage of that and changed it up as much as they could to keep things fresh. Homemade spatzel with buttered cabbage was a wonderful little meal that was perfect during the Dust Bowl for a few reasons. It was perfect for people who came from other countries to settle down in America, like the Germans and a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe. It was a dish that was basically just an egg noodle, popular in lots of European cuisines. Despite how it sounds, it really was just an everyday meal, and a pretty good one at that. For this, all you would need is flour, eggs, and water, and sometimes milk. That alone put it out of the price ranges of many, But the ones that could afford to move and settle down in one of the frontline countries of the world could definitely afford their flour too. Buttered cabbage was something that was a lot cheaper to get. People would make those DIY homemade noodles we talked about earlier and pair it up with buttered cabbage when they couldn't get the other ingredients. It was a feel-good, comfort food type of meal that brought some joy back into people's day as they ate. Chicken Marengo holds a storied place in culinary history, famously prepared for Napoleon after the Battle of Marengo. This dish encapsulates the essence of victorious improvisation using local ingredients available at the time. Chicken Marengo starts with chicken pieces sautéed in olive oil, braised with onions, garlic, and tomatoes, enriched by a splash of white wine that deglazes the pan, forming a robust sauce. Later additions often include mushrooms, and traditionally, it was garnished with fried eggs and crayfish, though these are less common today. The slow simmering melds all the flavors beautifully, allowing the tomatoes to break down and create a rich, savory sauce that complements the tender chicken perfectly. This dish exemplifies French provincial cooking, utilizing straightforward techniques and local ingredients to produce a dish rich in history and flavor. Chicken Kiev packs a punch with its chicken breasts stuffed with herbed butter, all wrapped up in a crispy breadcrumb coating. The dish stirs up a bit of a debate about its roots. Some folks reckon it was whipped up by French chefs back in the early 19th century, while others swear it was crafted by a Ukrainian chef in a Moscow kitchen in the early 20th century. Regardless of its backstory, Chicken Kiev began turning heads internationally around mid-20th century, becoming the go-to at dinner parties and special events. The traditional way to do it? Flatten those chicken breasts, tuck in a mix of butter, garlic, and herbs, roll them up, bread them, and fry to a golden brown. When sliced, the butter inside just bursts out, making a rich, flavorful sauce. By the 1960s, it had secured its spot on menus across America, often served with a side of veggies or rice. Long before store-bought bread was an everyday staple, cornmeal was the backbone of many working-class meals. Cheap, shelf-stable, and endlessly versatile, it found its way into countless recipes, none more practical than corn dodgers. These simple golden brown dumplings were either fried to crisp perfection or baked until firm, then served with a drizzle of syrup or a pat of butter. Corn dodgers were a direct descendant of Depression-era survival cooking, when wheat flour was too expensive for daily use. Cornmeal, on the other hand, was affordable and widely available, especially in the South and Midwest. Mixed with a little water, salt, and sometimes a splash of milk, it formed a dough sturdy enough to hold its shape in the frying pan. The result was a crispy on the outside, tender on the inside bite of pure comfort. Paired with a bit of molasses or honey, whatever was on hand, it became a meal that kids actually looked forward to. Some families made them dense and chewy, while others leaned toward a lighter, almost hush-puppy-like texture. However they were served, one thing was certain. Corn dodgers proved that even the simplest ingredients could be transformed into something satisfying. No frills, no waste, just good, honest food. The ground beef veggie stew is the perfect combination of simple ingredients and a big flavor. This dinner dish is a budget-friendly and nutritious dinner option made with ground beef and a variety of vegetables. Plus, it's a great way to use up any leftover vegetables you might have hanging out in your fridge. You can customize this stew to your liking. Throw in some chopped potatoes for extra starch, or add a splash of your favorite hot sauce for a kick. Ground beef. Veggie stew is a classic comfort food that's easy to make, but let's be honest, it's vanishing from our tables because it can't compete with the modern options. You know, like the Crunch Wrap Supreme from Taco Bell. I bet Taco Bell doesn't remind you of your grandma and your cousins, though. Cabbage and onion soup was a medieval recipe that's pretty much stayed consistent with how we have it today. It was something that involved a watery, thin soup made out of spices, water, and some aromatics, and brought to a boil gradually. This would be done in earthen pots over a campfire, and it was one of the most perfect things to have during winter. While the preparation is largely the same across several centuries, the convenience isn't. As time went on, we obviously developed many things to cope with the long and harsh winter months, but on the flip side of things, when it was medieval times, People really just died in the winters, mostly out of hunger. Crops simply would not last, would not sprout in time. Some of the crops would fail, the land may simply go barren, or you may just not have damaged crops from rodents. Any one of these uncontrollable, unpredictable circumstances could essentially just ruin your entire year. Cabbage was important because it was very easy to store in the winter. As far as the nutrition goes, this is pretty okay when it comes to making sure you get everything you need. Comparatively, it was a lot better than other kinds of soups because it could be made very easily. The more convenient it was to make a dish, the more it would be preferred among the people, especially if it was very easy to grow it. Cabbage could also be used to make a lot of different kinds of things, so it was always worth it to invest in them. Onions were a very reliable vegetable because they were one of the most essential flavorings. The food back then was typically bland, and they didn't have the means to make it any tastier, but stuff like this helped a lot. Bologna wasn't just for sandwiches. When money was tight and meat had to be stretched, it found its way into all kinds of meals, including breakfast, where it was ground up, fried, and turned into a creamy, savory gravy. Poured over biscuits or a few slices of white bread, ground bologna gravy took one of the cheapest meats on the market and transformed it into something warm, filling, and satisfying. Bologna had long been a go-to protein for working-class families. Made from a mix of leftover meat trimmings, it was significantly cheaper than fresh cuts of beef or pork, but still packed enough flavor to carry a dish. Frying it first gave it a crispy, caramelized edge, while the addition of milk and flour turned it into a rich, hearty gravy. Served over whatever bread was available, it became a meal that could keep a family going through the day. For those who grew up eating it, the smell of sizzling bologna in a cast-iron skillet brings back memories of weekend breakfasts and weekday suppers alike. It wasn't fancy, but that wasn't the point. It was resourcefulness at its best. A way to take something simple and turn it into comfort food with just a few basic ingredients and a little time at the stove. Coquille Saint-Jacques is a dish that exudes elegance, featuring scallops baked in a creamy sauce and often served right in their shells. This dish's charming name, which translates to St. James's shells, nods to St. James, the patron saint of pilgrims, and references the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. To prepare it, scallops are gently sautéed in butter, then bathed in a sauce crafted from white wine, cream, and shallots. The final touch is a sprinkle of breadcrumbs before baking until the top turns a tempting golden brown. This dish offers a delightful exploration of scallops' delicate and sweet flavors, beautifully enhanced by the creamy sauce. Coquille Saint-Jacques has long been a fixture at festive dinners where its refined and sophisticated character is a favorite. So, by now, it wasn't really too common for vegetable kebabs to be a thing in the States yet. They hadn't made their mark, especially by the Dust Bowl era, but some families that did come from Middle Eastern backgrounds made use of their backyard gardens to make this dish. Those families were few and far in between, which is why the recipe hadn't really seen mainstream success just yet, but lots of people adopted it anyway because of one simple fact. You could cook this over an open fire, and the grilled onions people would pair with it were just perfect. If families did have any kind of access to meat, then they used it here. Little chunks of beef were preferred, but even chicken would do. The best part about these was how you could make them with just potatoes and still come out with a wonderful dish. Speaking of potatoes, remember how I talked about how people traded them? When they weren't making soups, casseroles, and kebabs out of them, people used their backyard produce for bartering. Although entirely an ages-old concept, bartering for things made a return throughout the 1930s thanks to how bad things got. Money really wasn't worth anything more, and people thought it was better to just trade for things you needed. Rabbit stew is a beloved traditional dish in various cultures, renowned for its hearty and comforting nature. This stew typically features tender pieces of rabbit slow-cooked with onions, garlic, and aromatic herbs like rosemary or thyme, which subtly enhance the mild flavor of the rabbit. Additional vegetables such as carrots, celery, and potatoes often join the mix, creating a robust, one-pot meal. The stewing liquid, usually wine or stock, enriches the dish, lending depth and complexity as it simmers. Rabbit meat, known for its leanness and delicacy, benefits greatly from the slow cooking process, becoming incredibly tender and infused with the rich flavors of the broth and vegetables. Rabbit stew is especially appreciated during the colder months or in rural settings where rabbit is a common game meat. Rice and raisins were a really humble dish. When I talk about the psychological factor when it comes to eating, I'm referring to dishes like this. Rice on its own is perfectly edible, and it's something that people have eaten plain with nothing else for centuries. But eventually, that got old, didn't it? And even in the toughest of times, people needed a good snack, a sweet treat, something for the soul, a lot like how we do now. Their way of doing this on a budget? Take advantage of what Mother Nature's growing for you and throw in some raisins, which were really lovely because they were something that was abundant. You could either forage it, you could buy small boxes in bulk, and these were still relatively affordable, or government commodity drives and distributions would drop a few in your basket. The simplest iteration of this dish is just rice and raisins boiled in water, salt, and a pot. But if you want to take it a bit further, you can also mix in some milk, sugar, and butter, and elevate this dish into something that's a lot closer to a kind of rice-based custard or pudding. Kind of like kheer, from Southeast Asian cultures if you've ever had it. So, the cabbage was really similar. Basically, during the Dust Bowl, it was mostly a competition of how fast you could grow something and how conveniently you could do it. People weren't bothering with anything that took more effort than it was worth or didn't give immediate results. And honestly, I completely get them. Why would you waste your time on crops that are inherently difficult to grow when even the easy ones are going through so much crop failure? Cabbage was one of those easy-to-grow plants, and it became a national savior for lots of people. Cabbage stir-fry with onions and garlic was something people could enjoy every other day, as most of the core ingredients were things they had already been growing in their backyard gardens or preserving for a long while. At this point, the average American person is still used to keeping their experience with cabbage to just burgers, but the Dust Bowl pushed everyone out of their comfort zone just for the sake of survival. Veal Oscar is a decadent dish featuring breaded veal cutlets topped with crab meat, asparagus, and hollandaise sauce. The dish is named after King Oscar II of Sweden, who was known for his love of fine dining and was created in the late 19th century. King Oscar II's enthusiastic patronage of the arts and fine dining inspired not only this dish, but also helped to popularize Swedish culinary traditions abroad. He was an avid gastronome and patron of the arts, inspiring this luxurious dish. The traditional preparation involves breading and frying the veal cutlets, then topping them with sautéed crab meat and steamed asparagus. The dish is finished with a rich and creamy hollandaise sauce, creating a luxurious and indulgent meal. Veal Oscar was a popular choice in high-end restaurants and special occasions where its elegant presentation was appreciated. When meat was scarce and paychecks had to stretch, dinner often started with one humble ingredient: potatoes. Cheap, filling, and always available, they could be transformed into just about anything. One particularly resourceful creation called potato sizzler involved grating them up, frying them in bacon drippings with a handful of onions, and stirring in a beaten egg to bind it all together. Crisp on the edges, hearty in the middle, and packed with smoky flavor, this simple dish had everything it needed to stand on its own as a meal. Bacon itself wasn't always in the budget, but the drippings? Those were liquid gold. Every working-class kitchen had a can of saved bacon grease sitting on the stovetop, ready to add flavor to whatever was cooking. Onions were another staple, cheap and able to stretch even the simplest dish into something satisfying. The egg, whisked in at the last moment, gave the sizzling potatoes just enough structure to hold together, making the meal feel a little more complete. For families who grew up on it, the smell of potatoes frying in a cast-iron skillet brings back memories of home. Stuffed chicken rolls. Don't you dare confuse these with Mickey D's chicken nuggets. Stuffed chicken rolls are the dinner of every kid's dream, 'cause who wouldn't want this cheesy goodness instead of some plain old broccoli soup? Imagine thin sliced chicken breasts pounded to tender perfection and then filled with a savory mixture of seasoned ground ham and melty cheese. Stuffed chicken rolls are a great way to elevate a simple chicken breast, and they're perfect for a special occasion or a fancy weeknight dinner. They're surprisingly easy to make, so don't be intimidated by their fancy appearance. Despite its appeal, stuffed chicken rolls have become less common as people opt for simpler, quicker meals. This has to be by far one of America's greatest inventions because even though it has vanished from dinner tables in the States, other nations around the world are devouring them. Boiled salt pork and beans are pretty much the same deal. Now, beans just happen to be man's best friend when the going gets rough. You have so many different kinds of them, and you can have twice as many different kinds of food with them. Stews, soups, or something as economical as this. Boiled salt pork and beans actually stems from the Depression era, and it was a way to stretch out meat rations when they were running low, which was usually always. This is more beans than pork, I'll admit, but either way, it's a protein power punch that you don't want to be missing from your diet. Boiled salt pork and beans are also some of the easiest kinds of plates of food you can make. You don't really need to do anything besides just take the salt pork and boil it, along with the beans, adding whatever seasonings, aromatics, and herbs you prefer. That's pretty much how a lot of people used it back then anyway, although we have the benefit of choosing much better cuts of meat than they did. Even with a dish like this, in the Depression era, people would essentially just wait until the butcher's shops were discarding their most unwanted parts of the animal, and that's what they would buy for as cheap of a price as they could bargain for. It was usually something most shops were happy to let go of for some chump change, but nowadays, even that's like half your rent. Beef bourguignon is a cornerstone from Burgundy, involving marinated and slow-cooked beef chunks, typically tougher cuts like chuck, bathed in red wine, usually Burgundy, to tenderize the meat over several hours. This hearty stew is fortified with onions, garlic, and carrots, and enhanced with sautéed mushrooms and crisp lardons. Historically, this method likely evolved as a means to tenderize and enrich less desirable cuts of meat. The stew develops a rich, deep umami flavor from the Maillard reaction, which occurs as the beef browns, and the complex flavors intensify as the wine slowly melds with the herbs and vegetables. The slow cooking process not only enriches the stew's flavor, but also fills the kitchen with an inviting aromatic warmth, making beef bourguignon synonymous with comforting, rich French culinary tradition. Similarly enough, people were having a lot of fun with all the different things you could do with celery. You could braise your celery with potatoes to have something resembling a home-cooked meal. It would often work too. Your knowledge of the Dust Bowl may be about its ecological extremes, though. I mean, it felt like that little chunk of the planet was throwing a generational hissy fit. What people did to cope with the trifecta of war, economic breakdown, and ecological disaster was a lot more interesting, at least to me, and hopefully to you too. Do you remember how I keep mentioning those backyard gardens people had? They were known as victory gardens, and the basic idea was to basically begin farming and planting crops on whatever fertile soil you had. Since potatoes were such an easy crop to grow, and since they could last in almost every kind of environment, it became really common for people to grow potatoes along with celery in these gardens. The end result was always a dish like braised celery and potatoes or mashed potatoes alongside celery, or a stew or broth. It was pretty efficient, and it would also double as trade for people, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the next potato-based item. Steak Diane is an iconic dish featuring tender beefsteak smothered in a delectable cognac sauce, often flambéed right at your table for a touch of dining drama. Originating in mid-20th century America, this dish is named after the Roman goddess Diana. Its preparation includes pan-frying beef tenderloin and concocting a sauce from the pan juices, cognac, butter, mustard, and Worcestershire sauce. Adding a flambé enhances the rich flavors of the sauce dramatically. Steak Diane's allure was heightened by its theatrical preparation, often becoming the centerpiece of dining experiences in fine New York City restaurants such as the Drake and the Sherry Netherland, where celebrities frequently dined. Thought to have debuted in the 1950s in New York City, it quickly became a cornerstone of high-end dining. It was often served with mashed potatoes or vegetables, embodying the elegance of mid-century dining. Now, Swiss steak is like a warm hug from the past. This dish is all about slow-cooked, fall-apart tender beef bathed in a tangy tomato sauce. Think slow cooker vibes, but way before slow cookers were even a thing. Now, the Swiss steak is all about patience. The longer you simmer the beef, the more melt-in-your-mouth delicious it becomes. It's also the perfect way to use up that tougher cut of meat you accidentally grabbed at the store. If you grew up thinking this dish was from Switzerland, as the name suggests, now would be a good time for me to tell you your whole life was a lie. This technique of cooking up tender meat came from England, so they're the ones to thank for this meaty goodness. When tomato sauce wasn't in the pantry and butter wasn't an option, a surprising combination stepped in: mayonnaise and mustard. Tossed with hot spaghetti noodles and seasoned with a dash of salt and pepper, this unusual pairing became a quick-fix meal known as mayo and mustard spaghetti, which was both budget-friendly and undeniably memorable. Spaghetti itself was one of the most affordable dry goods available, filling enough to feed a family without requiring much else. Mayonnaise, often stocked in refrigerators for sandwiches and salads, brought richness and a creamy texture, while mustard added just enough tang to keep things interesting. It wasn't gourmet, but it turned plain pasta into something that felt like a complete dish without the need for meat, cheese, or expensive sauces. In working-class households, meals like this weren't about following a recipe. They were about making do with what was available. Kids grew up eating it straight from the pot, a quick meal before heading outside to play or finishing homework at the kitchen table. It may not have been a dinner guests would rave about, but for those who remember it, the taste still lingers as a reminder of simpler times and just how far a few basic ingredients could go. Before slow cookers and instant meals, there was fricassee, a dish that turned simple ingredients into something extraordinary. This creamy chicken stew had roots in European cooking, but became a homecoming dinner favorite in American kitchens, especially in the South and Midwest. It was rich, comforting, and made the most of what was available. Chicken fricassee was the perfect example of resourceful cooking. In the days when whole chickens were bought instead of pre-cut parts, every bit was used. The meat was gently simmered in a velvety sauce made from broth, butter, and cream, creating a dish that felt indulgent without being expensive. Paired with dumplings or rice, it was a filling meal that stretched to feed a crowd. What made fricassee special was its balance between rustic and refined. Unlike fried or roasted chicken, this method kept the meat exceptionally tender, absorbing the sauce's deep flavors. Some families added carrots and peas, while others preferred a touch of sherry for extra depth. But no matter the variation, it was a dish meant to be ladled generously and served with warm, crusty bread. So why did it disappear? As boneless, skinless chicken breasts became the norm, slow-cooked dishes like this fell out of favor. Sole meunière is a delicate and refined French classic, consisting of tender fish fillets lightly dredged in flour, sautéed in butter, and spritzed with lemon. The dish gets its name, meunière, from the traditional French technique used in its preparation. It first captured hearts in France early in the 20th century, where it quickly became a fixture in upscale dining. Julia Child's profound endorsement of sole meunière, after experiencing it as her first memorable meal at La Couronne restaurant in 1948, catapulted the dish to international fame and sparked her lifelong passion for French cuisine. To whip up sole meunière, the fish fillets are sautéed until golden, then drizzled with a simple butter, lemon, and parsley sauce. Usually served with a side of veggies or potatoes, this dish offers a light, refreshing meal that perfectly showcases the subtle flavors of the fish. Fried eggplants were another thing that people couldn't get enough of during then, especially with spiced tomato sauce. Like I said, it really took a lot of trial and error to find something that had enough flavor to it. This was something that people immediately knew was a gold mine of flavor, though. The eggplant was already spiced, and it was pretty crispy from the frying. The tomato sauce on its own is tangy, which works really well with an eggplant. Still, if you choose to turn it up a notch further and make it even more spicier, then this dish is definitely for you. It also helps that it's completely vegetarian, and like I said, if you're anything but a conventional person, you'll find most relief efforts to not be very accommodating. That was true for people who didn't want to eat much meat, since it took a while for lots of vegetable-based recipes to pop up in mainstream spaces. There was the benefit of wasting no money on meat, though, since, comparatively, any kind of animal or meat was a lot more expensive than a vegetable. This dish worked for reasons like that, but it was also just something that really kept you full. You had a lot of fiber and a lot of vitamin C, and I'm sure I don't need to explain how living in a chronic dust storm can be bad for your skin. Dandelion and bacon grease salad is an example of how Depression-era and 20th century foraging can actually lead to some really innovative recipes. This is something that's rooted in rural Midwestern culture, and this salad makes use of whatever is available in the wilds that day. One of the most common things you would ever find in these wilds was dandelion greens. They grew wild in all kinds of environments, roadsides, fields, and yards, and they were a really prized thing for the people. Most folks believed it was a natural remedy for a lot of things because it was believed to help with things like indigestion, inflammation, and strengthening your immune system. In subsistence farming areas and coal country, it was very common for families to teach their kids how to forage dandelion greens. Remember how I told you about the way bacon grease is used in a lot of these dishes? Yeah, so after frying the bacon, a small amount of bacon grease would be preserved and it would be used to flavor any kind of bland or plain dish like beans and cornbread and give it a bit of a savory edge. The rendered fat was really helpful to people because it also meant they didn't exactly need that much oil. Pork belly with cracklings is celebrated for its luxurious flavors and contrasting textures derived from the rich layers of meat and fat found in pork belly. The preparation process starts with scoring the skin and massaging it with a blend of salt, pepper, and aromatic herbs or spices to infuse flavor. The meat is slow roasted at a low temperature to render the fat and tenderize the meat, followed by a blast of high heat to crisp the skin into cracklings. This approach ensures the pork belly stays succulent, while the outer skin turns deliciously crisp. Often served sliced thickly and accompanied by applesauce or a cider reduction, this dish perfectly pairs the pork's richness with a touch of sweet acidity. The allure of pork belly with cracklings lies in the depth of its flavors and the satisfying interplay of tender meat with crispy skin. Barley risotto with mushrooms during the Dust Bowl was an interesting character study. On one hand, you had the middle class and below imitating risotto with barley, which made way for them to enjoy something that was typically reserved for the upper class. It was also one of the first few instances of people starting what would later become known as mock food culture. Do you ever hear about all kinds of mock apple pies, lasagnas, meatloafs? That was a series of recipes that were made with substitute ingredients, and the intention was to mimic the taste, texture, and feeling of otherwise popular dishes. It came out thanks to World War II, but I think the seeds were sown all the way before. Fresh mushrooms were hard, but it was still a lot easier to get wild mushrooms in the Dust Bowl. Eventually, people began to have a talent for foraging, and that was when the dish really came together on a regular basis for everybody. People started to make barley risotto thanks to these, and while traditional risotto was made with fresh mushrooms and arborio rice, people were making do with wild mushrooms and rice wherever they could. Eggplant parmesan is a hearty Italian-American favorite that layers crispy breaded eggplant slices with marinara sauce and cheese. This vegetarian delight originally hails from southern Italy, known there as melanzane alla parmigiana, and made its way to American shores with Italian immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The classic approach involves slicing the eggplant, breading it, and frying it until it's just the right shade of golden brown. These crispy slices are then layered with marinara sauce and a generous helping of mozzarella or parmesan, and baked until the cheese bubbles with joy. Eggplant parmesan became a staple in meatless meal traditions, particularly appreciated during the Lenten season among Catholic families in America. Gaining a firm foothold in American Italian eateries during the 20th century, it often comes served with a side of pasta or bread, rounding out a truly satisfying meal. There was a time when dinner didn't come from a drive-thru or a frozen box. It came from whatever was on hand. In kitchens where budgets were tight and grocery trips were limited, a humble combination of eggs, milk, flour, and butter could transform into something that filled bellies without emptying wallets. So how was egg sauce on saltines made? Hard-boiled eggs were mashed into a simple white sauce, thickened just enough to spoon over a stack of saltine crackers. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. Eggs were a working-class staple, packed with protein and cheap enough to buy by the dozen. A basic white sauce, made from milk, flour, and butter, was the foundation of countless Depression-era and post-war meals, stretching ingredients without overpowering them. Crackers? Those were always in the pantry, whether for soup, snacks, or in this case, an entire meal. Families who couldn't afford fresh bread every day turned to saltines as a substitute, their crisp texture adding just enough bite to an otherwise soft dish. It may not have been the most exciting dinner, but it was warm, filling, and familiar. Kids ate it without fuss. Parents appreciated how far it stretched, and for those who grew up on it, the taste is forever linked to simpler times. Side dishes were once as thoughtfully prepared as the main course, and few were as simple yet elegant as a well-roasted carrot medley. Coated in honey, butter, and a hint of cinnamon, this dish was a staple at homecoming dinners, adding a touch of natural sweetness to balance out heavier meats and casseroles. Carrots were a practical choice for home cooks. They were cheap, easy to store, and available year-round, making them a kitchen essential. Roasting them brought out their natural sugars, and when paired with honey and warm spices, they became more than just a side dish. They were a highlight. Some versions used maple syrup instead, while others incorporated fresh herbs for a more savory twist. No matter the variation, the result was always a vibrant, glossy medley of tender carrots with a flavor profile that felt both nostalgic and indulgent. As processed vegetable sides and microwave steamed bags took over grocery store shelves, many home cooks stopped roasting vegetables altogether. Instead of taking the time to caramelize their natural flavors, people opted for pre-cut and pre-cooked options. Hard cheese and bread is one of the oldest and most memorable pairings from the medieval period, and bread and cheese were some of the most core meals for people back then. It wasn't even a specific group of people, it was almost everyone. Monks, shepherds, travelers, nomads, farmers, fishermen, peasants, and even citizens. Bread would be made using whatever kind of grains were possibly available, and they were the typical ones we have gone over so far. If you were rich, you would just be eating wheat, and that was always a dead giveaway that you were rich too. The class disparity back then was pretty black and white. In the middle and lower classes, as they existed back then, you would get to see several different kinds of breads, like dark and rough ones, or fluffy but dense ones. Hard cheese was something that was favored over other kinds of dairies because it could be stored for a very long period without spoiling anything. Cheesemaking was something that was an extremely rural activity, and it was practiced in all kinds of homes, monasteries, and farms. Milk from sheep would be curdled via rennet and pressed, then salted and aged to make firm cheese. It was a practice that would go on throughout France, Switzerland, and even England. Once a staple of dinner parties and homecoming feasts, this elegant yet simple side dish was a favorite among home cooks looking to add a touch of sophistication to their meals. Crisp, tender green beans, lightly sautéed in butter and finished with toasted almonds, struck the perfect balance between freshness and richness. Green beans were one of the most accessible vegetables in American kitchens. Whether fresh, frozen, or canned, they were affordable and widely available year-round. Almonds, though slightly more expensive, were used sparingly, adding a crunchy contrast without overwhelming the dish. The preparation was straightforward. The beans were quickly blanched to preserve their bright color and firm texture, then tossed in a buttery skillet with slivered almonds for a nutty, golden brown finish. Some recipes included a squeeze of lemon or a sprinkle of garlic for extra depth. But as convenience cooking took hold, green bean almondine slowly faded from dinner tables. Canned green bean casseroles, loaded with processed ingredients, became the new standard, and simple, fresh preparations were overlooked in favor of heavier, creamier alternatives. Next on our list, we have boiled beans with garlic, which was an incredible staple across Europe, especially among monks and peasants. While peasants liked it because it was one of the few affordable things that they could get, monks liked them because of the sheer simplicity and health benefits. It kind of makes me feel really bad about how much unnecessary junk I eat when I do videos like this. These beans were one of the primary legumes that would be grown in medieval fields, and one of the most common ones were fava beans. These had become pretty native to the Old World, and they were even older than much of the beans we use today, like pinto, kidney, or black beans. Fava beans were incredibly resistant and tough, and they could work through the winter very well. They also did amazing whenever you would mix them in with garlic. It was one of the most affordable seasoning plants, and it could grow in climates that were otherwise too rough to support much crop growth. People kept it for medicinal purposes, as a flavoring, and as a last resort meal too. It was very common for Italian dishes in that era to feature sage, olive oil, and garlic as primary ingredients in most dishes. Monastic communities also relied on boiled beans and garlic, as it became a particularly good friend in their endeavor to sustain meatless diets forever. Mid-century America had a love affair with convenience, and nothing sold homemakers on a recipe faster than a catchy advertising campaign. In the 1960s, Wesson Oil promoted a dish that promised flavor, affordability, and, of course, a little Wessonality. It started with ground beef, one of the most budget-friendly proteins of the era, mixed with canned green beans and tomato soup, then topped with a generous handful of crushed potato chips. A little crunch, a little sauce, and a whole lot of practicality. Wessonality Surprise was designed for speed and efficiency. No complicated steps, no long cooking times, just a few pantry staples thrown together and baked into something that resembled a casserole. Canned green beans, already a staple in American kitchens, made the dish feel like a balanced meal, while the condensed tomato soup added a rich, slightly sweet tang. For families in the 60s, this kind of cooking was about making every dollar count. It was fast, it was filling, and thanks to Wesson's marketing, it became one of many quirky ad-driven meals that defined a generation of home cooking. A little strange? Maybe. But for busy families, it worked. Mid-century America had a love affair with convenience, and nothing sold homemakers on a recipe faster than a catchy advertising campaign. In the 1960s, Wesson Oil promoted a dish that promised flavor, affordability, and, of course, a little Wessonality. It started with ground beef, one of the most budget-friendly proteins of the era, mixed with canned green beans and tomato soup, then topped with a generous handful of crushed potato chips. A little crunch, a little sauce, and a whole lot of practicality. Wessonality Surprise was designed for speed and efficiency. No complicated steps, no long cooking times, just a few pantry staples thrown together and baked into something that resembled a casserole. Canned green beans, already a staple in American kitchens, made the dish feel like a balanced meal, while the condensed tomato soup added a rich, slightly sweet tang. For families in the 60s, this kind of cooking was about making every dollar count. It was fast, it was filling, and thanks to Wesson's marketing, it became one of many quirky ad-driven meals that defined a generation of home cooking. A little strange? Maybe. But for busy families, it worked. The last thing we have on our list is boiled turnips with butter sauce. Again, this is something we went over earlier. Most places really couldn't afford ovens, so the popular thing to do was to definitely boil your turnips instead of anything else. The butter sauce was a humble little typical sauce made with herbs and butter that added some smoothness to the turnips. For what it was worth, it did have a better texture. Overall, this dish was just a little comforting breakfast for most people. It wasn't exactly anything that would really fill you up, but it was a good way to start the morning. The sauce had some real oomph to it, and the boiled turnips, although a bit chewy, were something that kept people's appetites down for a while. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended, and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Milk soup was exactly this kind of dish. People really just wanted anything sweet during the Depression, mostly because, unlike carbohydrates and protein, it would actually change their mood. Something that was considered relatively impossible during the Depression, hence the name. Milk soup is also exactly what it sounds like. This isn't some kind of fancy dish where you add a lot of sherry wine or lots of rich foraged aromatics and herbs to the milk to make some tonic. This is literally just milk and flour. If you're particularly lucky on the day you make it, you might even add some butter. This would thicken the soup too, and well, make it more soup-like. Still, this was something that people kinda just gulped down because they had nothing else. I don't think it would particularly work well today for us because it's so hard to get anyone today to drink milk regularly unless it's in a frappe. So imagine serving milk soup. It's just not something that does a lot for you, you know? Still, assuming you have nothing else and absolutely no options left to try either, then it might make for an okay filler snack. What do you think? Is milk soup something you'd give an honest shot to? During the Dust Bowl, one thing that was actually more common than you may ever think was lasagna with homemade noodles. Though of course, as with everything here, there is a catch. It's not the lasagna you're thinking of or the one Garfield's famous for falling in love with. Not anywhere close, no. It was instead vegetable lasagna, and the noodles were really DIY serviceable versions that just barely met the mark. It was such a disaster in Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas that people there were lucky to have anything even remotely resembling noodles still. After all, most of the stuff you'd use for homemade noodles was going through crop failure or food shortages. People really began to get into homemade noodles after they had a bit more experience growing food on their own, and when they could more reliably get potatoes out of their victory gardens. As far as the lasagna went, cabbages, spinach, carrots, kale, onions, broccoli, anything people had that was green would go in it. This was also a dish that inspired people to really take advantage of canned food too, and they definitely did by substituting a lot of root vegetables with canned goods. Don't get the wrong idea though, these were really makeshift versions of both dishes. It was nowhere near an actual vegetable lasagna either. It was more fitting to call it a lot of layered vegetables, really. Duck à l'orange is a venerable French dish that pairs roasted duck breast with a vibrant, tangy orange sauce. Its rich history dates back to the 19th century, enjoying popularity among French aristocrats. The duck is typically roasted to achieve a crispy exterior, while the sauce is crafted from a reduction of orange juice, stock, and a hint of Grand Marnier or Cointreau. By the 1970s, this dish had become a hallmark of sophisticated dining, frequently chosen for elegant dinner parties or upscale restaurants. The delightful contrast between the rich, savory duck and the fresh, citrusy sauce creates an unforgettable flavor profile that showcases the dish's aristocratic French origins. The meticulous preparation and exquisite presentation make duck à l'orange a true culinary masterpiece. In working-class kitchens, the best meals weren't always planned. They were thrown together with whatever was available. A pound of ground beef, a can of tomatoes, some diced potatoes, and a handful of elbow macaroni could turn into a thick, hearty stew that stuck to your ribs and stretched across multiple meals. Some called it slumgullion, others just called it dinner. Dishes like this had no strict recipe, just a basic formula, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. One night it might be heavy on potatoes, the next, macaroni took center stage. Some families added onions for flavor, while others bulked it up with beans or whatever vegetables were left in the fridge. The name slumgullion had been around since the 1800s, used by miners and sailors to describe a hodgepodge meal, proof that resourceful cooking had always been part of survival. Ground beef was one of the most affordable proteins in the 1960s, and canned tomatoes provided flavor without the cost of fresh produce. With a simple pot and a little seasoning, this one-dish meal fed entire families with ease. It was the kind of food that tasted even better the next day, reheated on the stove after a long shift or a day at school. Comfort food without the price tag. Remember when your mom used to whip you up lunch for school along with a heartfelt note and a sweet treat? Meat and potato patties were a staple back in the day and a hit in the lunchbox. If you've got some leftover mashed potatoes lying around, you've got to try these. Yeah, these are basically patties made out of mashed potatoes combined with seasoned ground meat, shaped into little discs, and fried till golden brown. They pair perfectly with ketchup, your favorite dipping sauce, or even a dollop of sour cream for a tangy twist. Meat and potato patties are the ultimate finger food that is still a hit to this day. Well, with McDonald's French fries on the rise, these really don't make an appearance that often, but you can whip these patties up anytime. They're surprisingly easy to make. Just give your mom a call and ask for the recipe. Rye pancakes are a fantastic option to go for if you have a family of 4 and live in prehistoric times. They were one of the most common recipes, despite what you might be thinking. These people were still walking around wearing chainmail armor and robes, so how'd they end up having pancakes? Well, they're actually pretty different from the kinds of pancakes we're used to today. These are just rye flour, water, some salt, and that's it. It makes a batter that can be ladled, but most people would typically just pour it onto a griddle or a hot stone suspended over a hearth. This was the most common way to cook desserts or breakfast in these times. If you were lucky enough to have milk or buttermilk, you could replace the water with that, and it would usually make them a bit more tender. People typically fried these in butter or animal fat. Well, if it wasn't a fasting day. Rye usually does not need to be flavored much, but what flavorings people did use, they were very different from what we have today. People used stewed vegetables, onions and garlic instead of Miracle Whip, rainbow sprinkles and maple syrup. Another one you might be surprised to see in a video about medieval-era recipes is honey and oat cakes. Oats were really common in northern and western regions like Ireland, Scandinavia, and Scotland, and this was because the climate was really cold. It was much easier to grow them than, let's say, wheat. Oats were something that would thrive in poor soils, and they also had shorter growing seasons, which meant that they became a pristine source of food when times were tough and you were running low in your pantry. A very basic oat cake would typically be made from coarsely ground oatmeal, water, and some salt, and this mix would be made into a slightly hard dough, rolled very thin, and then cooked on a baking stone. These were durable, portable, and crispy, so they were the perfect meal for long journeys. Alongside some honey, which was the primary sweetener before sugar, it was one of the best meals you could have for celebrations. While people did use them in their daily lives, rural peasants most often got to enjoy them during festivals and religious holidays in monasteries. It's also interesting to note that honey was seen as a bounty of the earth that carried divine favor, and so honey and oat cakes were seen as a good blessing for wedding feasts. Corn dodgers weren't always the Super Bowl phenomena you know them to be today. Back in the day, they were actually one of the few ways where families could eat and still be full. Corn dodgers basically involve corn cakes that are either fried or baked and then served as a main dish. But when people had any kind of meat or potatoes, just anything at all that was bulkier and heavier to serve it with, they would almost always serve it as a side dish. Still, corn dodgers were essential to getting by the day back then, and they're just as important now. Making these at home is as easy as it gets as well, because once you have the mixture for a corn cake ready, which is a really simple process involving like 3 steps max, all you need to do is shape them into form and get to frying. These make for such a cheap and affordable midday snack, and they're the perfect thing to come back to from work. Best part? You can prepare meals and make enough corn cake batter and just freeze it, so you don't even have to deal with the entire process when you get back home tired from work. Oysters Rockefeller consists of succulent oysters on the half shell, topped with a rich buttery mixture of finely chopped herbs and breadcrumbs, then baked or broiled until golden. Originating in 1899 at Antoine's in New Orleans, one of America's historic restaurants, the dish's exact recipe remains a secret but typically includes spinach, celery, and sometimes an anise-flavored liqueur, creating a luxurious topping. The oysters are gently poached in their shells to retain moisture, then crowned with this seasoned blend. After assembling, they are broiled until the topping bubbles and browns slightly, offering a delightful contrast in textures between the creamy, tender oyster and the crisp, flavorful topping. Oysters Rockefeller is not only a treat for the palate, but also a creative celebration of local ingredients, elevating the simple oyster to a decadent culinary experience. Swiss chard is a leafy green we don't hear too much about anymore, and that was the case back then too. I don't blame people, since its glory days were definitely before the 20th century. But people remembered this little green once again during the Dust Bowl. People would pair this up with white bean soup, which was something that the masses found it very hard to live without. Why? They were a fabulous source of protein, they are affordable, you could even forage them, and these could actually be stored for months. This was a time where people were desperate for protein, by the way. A lot of good cuts of meat were more expensive than ever, and just out of the reach of most common people, while a lot of other kinds of things like nuts and almonds just weren't filling you up enough for the amount of money or time it would take to get enough of them. You had to be really smart with every cent, so people would go for things like white bean soup with Swiss chard. This was a versatile combination that had every pro health-wise on top of being something that could feed the entire family and be made with minimal effort. Crab Louie, also known as the King of Salads, is a classic that originated on the U.S. West Coast in the early 20th century. While its birthplace is up for debate, some say the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, others point to Solari's restaurant in Seattle. It always features Dungeness crab, hard-boiled eggs, asparagus, tomatoes, and a creamy dressing made from mayonnaise, chili sauce, and spices. Crab Louie was dubbed the King of Salads by the San Francisco Chronicle in 1914, a nod to its deluxe ingredients and popularity among the elite. It first gained traction in the 1920s and 1930s, becoming a favored dish for lighter dinners or luncheons. The mix of crisp lettuce, savory crab, and tangy dressing, served up in an elegant presentation, made it a must-have at many a high-end restaurant and social gathering. Stretching ingredients wasn't just a skill in the 1960s, it was a necessity. When a handful of leftover meat and a few vegetables weren't enough for a full meal, they found new life inside a flaky pie crust, topped with a generous layer of mashed potatoes. Hoosier pie supper was an answer to the age-old question: what can we make with what we have? Midwestern families, especially in Indiana, had been making similar dishes for generations, influenced by their farming roots and a deep tradition of waste not cooking. Mashed potatoes were a constant in working-class households, cheap, filling, and easy to make in large batches. A single pie could take scraps of roast beef, bits of ham, or even just a few spoonfuls of vegetables and turn them into a meal hearty enough to satisfy a family after a long day's work. It was baked until golden brown, emerging from the oven as a warm, comforting dish that filled the house with a familiar, savory aroma. Served with a ladle of brown gravy, it was about making sure nothing went to waste. In an era where food stretched as far as a paycheck, this dish wasn't just frugal. It was common sense wrapped in a flaky crust. Once a staple of working-class kitchens, this hearty one-dish meal was built on the kind of ingredients that stretched a family's budget without sacrificing flavor. Cabbage, potatoes, and smoked sausage, three of the most economical and widely available foods, came together in layers, baked slowly in a rich mustard cream sauce. The result was a rustic, deeply satisfying dish that filled bellies and kept families warm through colder months. Cabbage was a practical ingredient, valued for its long shelf life and versatility. When paired with smoky seasoned sausage and starchy potatoes, it created a meal that was both inexpensive and packed with flavor. The mustard-infused cream sauce added a tangy richness, tying everything together. Some home cooks added a dash of vinegar for brightness, while others incorporated cheese for extra indulgence. No matter the variation, this dish was proof that humble ingredients could create something truly special. Why did it fall out of favor? The rise of prepackaged meals and low-carb trends made cabbage-heavy dishes less common, and as quick stovetop meals replaced slow-baked casseroles, this once popular dish faded from view. Cabbage and corned beef hash have a really practical history in American food culture. It's something that came about as a humble wartime dish whose purpose was to turn any leftovers into something that could really get people seated at the table, but it also just shows you how resourceful people were. Corned beef hash was pretty recent, considering it made its name during World War I and World War II, right when it was introduced into the United States. The canned version, like the Hormel's cans you've probably seen lining up grocery store marts, is actually something that was the lifeblood of many people back then. Corned beef hash was an insane step forward because it meant that rationed, affordable, preserved meat was now more accessible than ever. And that only meant that things like cabbage, which were year-round vegetables, were that much more in demand as side items, ingredients, and toppings. Corned beef hash was a way for people to have cheap calories and protein, and it makes sense too, because the thing was designed for maximum efficiency, so it could be used by soldiers during wartime. So naturally, people did a few other things with kale than the ones we've gone over so far. One of those was a kale and chickpea stir-fry, which actually got a lot more positive PR than you would think. Seriously, before this decade, chickpeas never had this kind of clout. Suddenly, they were the Wagyu steak of America, though. It was all you ever really wanted to get your hands on. Kale was still something that was difficult for the American masses to consume regularly, but it was a work in progress. That stir-fry definitely made it a lot more digestible for most, and people didn't have the option of saying no based on their tastes. If it was there, and especially if it wasn't spoiled, you would suck it up and simply eat. What else were you to do? Turn down the perfectly good plate of food in the horrible, historically chaotic drought and recession going on? Plus, this was a good way to check off a lot of nutritional boxes that were otherwise going unfulfilled. While kale was a bit hard to get in some areas, typically ones that were farther away from markets, it was still something people got their hands on eventually, usually thanks to family. Chickpeas weren't that hard to get, and the rest was just a matter of getting on the stove and putting in the work. Which was really hard, mind you. People were exhausted. Ham steak with pineapple is a dish that offers a delightful contrast of flavors, featuring a grilled ham steak topped with a juicy pineapple ring. This simple yet appealing dish first gained popularity in the United States during the mid-20th century, becoming a go-to for easy, satisfying dinners. The process involves grilling or pan-frying the ham steak until it's nicely browned, then crowning it with a pineapple ring and occasionally a cherry for a festive touch. The sweet and savory combination of ham and pineapple delivers a unique and enjoyable taste experience. Often accompanied by sides like mashed potatoes or green beans, ham steak with pineapple makes for a well-rounded, hearty meal. Monkey meat sandwiches were quick, required no cooking, and made use of pantry staples that were cheap, long-lasting, and easy to find. Corned beef was a product of necessity, not luxury. During World War II, canned meats became a lifeline due to rationing, and even after the war ended, they remained a budget-friendly option for working-class families. The addition of mayonnaise provided richness, while relish balanced it out with a tangy bite. Served between two slices of white bread, another inexpensive household staple, it was a no-fuss meal that filled stomachs without emptying wallets. For kids, it was a lunchtime classic, packed into metal lunchboxes alongside an apple and a thermos of milk. For parents, it was a way to make something out of almost nothing. Some might cringe at the thought today, but back then, this frugal creation was a reminder that resourcefulness often tasted better than it sounded. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Okay. This southern staple might still be a thing in some parts of the country, but let's be real, biscuits and sausage gravy is definitely not dominating breakfast menus anymore. I guess waffles are to blame for that. But this breakfast legend is the perfect combination of fluffy buttermilk biscuits so light and airy they practically melt in your mouth, along with a creamy sausage gravy, rich with savory sausage and speckled with black pepper. This is a breakfast, or hey, no judgment here, even a dinner combination that's pure comfort food heaven. From the perfect hangover cure to a delicious weekend treat, biscuits and sausage gravy satisfy all cravings. Just maybe lay off the white clothes while you're indulging. That sausage gravy can be a bit enthusiastic when it comes to staining. We're going to start our list off with cabbage and potato hash. Honestly, it doesn't get more economical than this either, so it's a fantastic place to start. Let me tell you a little something about cabbages and potatoes before we begin dissecting this dish. So, back in the days before modern refrigeration became such a nationally accepted miracle, people actually used to worry a lot about the seasonal nature of ingredients, fruits, and vegetables. Cabbage and potatoes were arguably the sole exception to this because they can be grown and cooked pretty much throughout the entire season. Now, this was also a dish that took barely any oil or lard, and also didn't really require any kind of cooking utensils, skills, or experience. It's one of the most ideal dinners because potatoes and cabbage are always available for dirt cheap in markets, and you can make an infinite amount of combinations through them. Though some people really don't like their cabbage, something about the texture. Which side of the boat do you find yourself leaning towards? Are cabbage and potato hash something you'd try if your wallet was in bad enough shape? Or would you have a taste anyway, just to see? Duck à l'orange marries the deep, rich flavors of duck with the sharp zestiness of oranges, a culinary duo dating back to the Renaissance, though it gained popularity in Paris in the early 20th century. This classic dish features roasted duck with a skin crisped to perfection, paired with a sweet and tangy orange sauce made from fresh orange juice, sugar, vinegar, and sometimes Grand Marnier. To perfect duck à l'orange, meticulous attention is paid to rendering the fat from the duck skin, ensuring it crisps up beautifully to contrast with the juicy meat beneath. The sauce is usually prepared separately and reduced to a luscious syrup, then drizzled over the duck just before serving to preserve its bold, vibrant flavors. This dish masterfully balances the rich, natural fat of the duck with the bright, acidic notes of citrus, showcasing refined culinary techniques. A dusty night could only be made better with a cheap meal. That was the motto of people stuck in the Dust Bowl. For the struggling families of the time, cheap didn't mean tasteless. It meant survival. Curious to see what kept them going. Green tomatoes were something people ate really regularly. It was tough to grow much else thanks to all the havoc the Dust Bowl was causing on the environment, and by 1936, it was already a period of long-lasting drought and dust storms. Not exactly the kind of surroundings that inspire a lot of vegetable growth. People regularly were dealing with crop failure, and it meant that lots of families had their sources of food and livelihoods cut off from them. Green tomatoes, on the other hand, were one of the few vegetables that people had no issues growing. That's why they got as popular as they did, because eventually, people would begin to hoard them. You'd make basic things out of them like fried green tomatoes with cornmeal coating, but it was enough to last you through the day. Ripe tomatoes were in even shorter supply, and what was available was either rationed or taken up by people in urban centers. It was quite hard for any lasting stock of vegetables to reach people in rural areas, and it was often those people who had it the worst during the Dust Bowl. Don't you love low-effort foods where you can just throw in the ingredients and let your slow cooker do all the work? Well, you would have loved festive, slow-cooked beef tips. As the name suggests, this one was a favorite at festive dinner parties and people couldn't stop raving about it. It's very simple, too. Tender beef tips simmered low and slow in a savory sauce brimming with flavor. You can customize the sauce to your liking. Add some red wine for a touch of sophistication, or maybe ranch if you aren't feeling fancy. No judgment here. Festive, slow-cooked beef tips are perfect for a busy weeknight or a casual weekend gathering. Just pop it in the slow cooker before you head out the door and come home to a delicious meal waiting for you. The tasty meat pie isn't your average store-bought pie. We're talking about a savory masterpiece filled with delicious goodness. This used to be a classic at Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners back in the day before hash brown casseroles came to take the cake. But tasty meat pies had their own beauty. Imagine a flaky, golden brown crust with a filling of seasoned ground meat, chopped vegetables like carrots and peas, and a rich, flavorful gravy. The origins of the meat pie have been traced back to the Neolithic period, around 6000 BC. Yeah, even the Egyptians were a fan of this classic. It's perfect for a potluck, a family dinner, or even a cozy night in. The best part? Its portability. Just grab a slice and head out the door. It's the ultimate dinner on the go. Surf and turf really takes the cake for a luxury meal. merging the delights of the sea and land by pairing a succulent steak with lobster. This gem debuted on the American dining scene back in the 60s, quickly becoming the crown jewel of fine dining. There's a bit of a toss-up about who first whipped it up, but it's usually linked to those high-end steakhouses and seafood joints. The phrase surf and turf likely popped up during that era, perfectly capturing the essence of a lavish meal. Typically, you'd find a tender beef steak, like a filet mignon, grilled to perfection next to a beautifully broiled lobster tail, all rounded off with a side of melted butter and occasionally a decadent béarnaise sauce. In the 1970s, this dish really hit its stride, especially at celebratory events or upscale eateries, becoming a symbol of the American fascination with all-out luxury dining where piling two premium ingredients onto one plate was the ultimate indulgence. So, the next thing we have is roasted carrots with parsnips and herb butter. Now, I know you've heard a lot about how butter was barely available during the Depression, and especially the Dust Bowl. Herb butter, on the other hand, is a bit different from the traditional butter you've heard about. This is also a pretty standard custom that's existed throughout the history of the United States, especially in communities like the Native American ones. What really is it, though? Herb butter is basically just butter mixed in with a cocktail of different herbs. You put in basil, parsley, thyme, oregano, basically anything and everything you have. It's been a thing for people who had access to gardens or farming land, and a lot of rural areas would also grow loads of herb butter. This is because they already had space to grow so many herbs that herb butter was simply the next step on the road. This is pretty much one of the best ways you can enjoy your butter, as it really adds an entirely new world of flavor to just about whatever it is you're making. This is even more true for something like roasted carrots and parsnips. I mean, let's be honest, the roasting definitely helps, but it's not like we're working with a lot of flavor here. So, a sliced onion and mayonnaise sandwich was actually a proper friend to people back then. This meal still felt like pre-crisis times in the 20th century, when you could come home expecting a sandwich every day. Onions were again preferred so heavily because of how easy they were to grow, how cheap they were to buy, how well they survived in most climates, and the immense amount of variety that they had. A few slices of onions, caramelized, with beautiful mayonnaise was literally heaven to people back then. It's also just like diet-friendly food now. This is something that really takes no money, effort, time, or resources. Well, besides 2 slices of bread and some onions to make, and gives you a filling sandwich in return, which is more than most can say for a lot of meals that came from the toughest times in the 20th century. It was definitely peasant food, but it was still something that tasted good, which was really all somebody wants when they're in a bad spot. Back in the 1950s, the Divan Parisian restaurant at Chatham Hotel in New York City gave birth to its signature dish, the chicken divan casserole. This mouth-watering dish soon found its way to all our homes, and I'm not complaining. It's made of tender chicken pieces nestled amongst vibrant green broccoli florets in a rich and creamy sauce, topped with a generous layer of melty cheese and a sprinkle of crispy breadcrumbs. The chef who leaked this recipe out to the public really took one for the team, and we can never thank him enough. It's the perfect combination of protein, veggies, and all the cheesy goodness your heart desires. Just maybe pair it with a side salad to pretend you're being healthy. Chicken divan casserole is the retro dish of every cheese lover's dreams, and you know what that calls for? A comeback. It's a classic at throwback parties, but you don't really need an excuse to cook this up. A typical Tuesday night works too. Barley bread is one of the oldest kinds of loaded breads that you can find in European history. It's completely medieval and has a history that goes back thousands of years. This is because among all the grains in the world, barley is arguably one of the first that we ever domesticated. It was first cultivated in the Fertile Crescent, which, if you don't know where that is, it's the area that covers modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Barley bread was one of the most common kinds of bread in the early Middle Ages, and it went onwards towards the High Middle Ages as well. This was typically considered to be a peasant bread, though. It had a coarse texture, it was darker than other breads, and it did not really have enough gluten. It was hard bread because of that fact. It was actually a bit of a sign of your economic class if you were constantly having barley bread, because only the rich people would get to eat fluffy white loaves of bread like we're used to. Lamb Navarin is a traditional French stew that sings of spring, packed with tender lamb and fresh spring vegetables. Originating from Normandy, this dish is best when the ingredients are at their peak freshness, typically prepared in the spring. The name Navarin itself is inspired by the French word for turnip, navette, a staple in this hearty stew. The process starts by browning the lamb to perfection, then slow cooking it with turnips, carrots, onions, and potatoes in a flavorful broth until everything is tender and infused with flavor. Lamb Navarin is a dish that really captures the essence of spring, highlighting both the succulence of the lamb and the sweetness of the fresh vegetables. It's commonly served with crusty bread or a side of rice, making it a fulfilling and comforting meal. Collard green wraps with black beans and corn is a pretty loaded dish, especially for Dust Bowl era standards. Where do we really start here? The greens weren't really that available throughout the Depression and Dust Bowl. It was because dried beans and corn were a staple in so many houses that not many could snatch them up for themselves. There was always a decent amount of people that were either too late, couldn't go, or just got unlucky. Corn wasn't that much of an issue, given how easy it was to grow, and how just about everyone became really good at growing it. Black beans were harder to come by, though. Still, when people did get it, they would definitely take advantage of it with this recipe. Collard greens and black beans were also. If you really wanted to get fancy with it, technically some people did add bits of leftover meat or ham and potatoes to it. They would also add in some ground meat, some rice, quinoa, or whatever else they were working with. Anything that would make the filling, well, more filling was good. It helped to have a dish like this because it reminded people of the times they were able to go out for a night on the town and eat good food. Turkey tetrazzini is a creamy, comforting pasta dish that features turkey, mushrooms, and parmesan, all baked to a golden finish. It was crafted by chef Ernest Arbogast at the Palace Hotel as a tribute to Italian opera singer Luisa Tetrazzini, believed to have been first made in San Francisco in the early 20th century. This dish begins by sautéing turkey and mushrooms, then melding them with a lush sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and chicken broth. The creamy mixture is then tossed with cooked spaghetti, sprinkled with Parmesan cheese, and baked until it's bubbly and golden. Turkey tetrazzini has become a classic American comfort food, especially popular for using up leftover turkey, making it a post-Thanksgiving favorite. If one of these meals brought back a memory or made you miss the way things used to taste, drop it in the comments. Give the video a like and subscribe.